Hello and welcome to section 2.2, which begins our discussion on conditional statements. A conditional is an if-then statement. So if P, then Q is how you would read that. If P is true, then Q is true. Hypothesis is the part following the if, and the conclusion is the part following the then. So the P is the hypothesis and the Q is the then. What are the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional given in my example? If an angle measures 130 degrees, then the angle is obtuse. So the hypothesis is the first part, the if part. It says an angle measures 130 degrees, so that is the hypothesis. The conclusion is the angle is obtuse. And that'll be part of what we're doing, is just figuring out the different parts of the conditional statement. Truth value, making a conditional value either true or false. So you have to either show that every example of your hypothesis is true, or you have to show a counterexample that is false. So depending which way you're trying to prove the conditional, that's what you have to prove. To negate something, negation is the opposite of a statement. The symbol is the little wavy line there in front of the P, and the wavy line means not P. Then we also have related conditional statements. Converse is to exchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if Q, then P is what you're saying. If the conclusion, then the hypothesis is true. So an example of that is if angle A is acute, then the measure of angle A equals 15 degrees. And there they have flipped around the hypothesis and the conclusion. Inverse means to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional. So you would say not P, then not Q. So if something is not the hypothesis, then it also is not the conclusion. So if the measure of angle A is not equal to 15, then angle A is not acute. That is an inverse statement. Contrapositive, you need to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the converse. So if not Q, then not P. So you're flipping it around so that it is the converse, and you're saying not to both of them again. So if angle A is not acute, then the measure of angle A is not 15 degrees. Equivalent statements, you'll have to do some of these, and that just means that they have the same truth value, so they'll either both be true or both be false. They can't be separated. So it's a conditional and its contrapositive are always equivalent. So they're always either both true or both false. The converse and the inverse are also equivalent. Same thing goes there. They're either both true or both false. And we'll do many examples of these so that they'll make more sense as we go. Here is one example. If the given statement is not in if-then form, rewrite it. Write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the given conditional statement, and determine the truth value of all four statements. And then if a statement is false, you have to give a counterexample to it. Now there's a lot going on there. Just take one piece at a time. The first thing is, look at the statement that is given. Swimmers are athletes. Okay? So we are going to need to rewrite that statement so that it is a conditional, because that is not an if-then statement. That just simply says swimmers are athletes. So the conditional would be, if a person is a swimmer, then they are an athlete. And that is true. Swimmers are athletes, so that conditional would be true. Converse. So you're flipping it around now. If a person is an athlete, then they are a swimmer. And that is false, because there are athletes that are not swimmers. You could put an example of any other athlete in there to prove that false for your counterexample. Inverse. If a person is not a swimmer, then they are not an athlete. That is also false. And if we go back to what I said, the equivalent statements where converse and inverse are equivalent, so they have to either both be false or both be true. And in this case, if you read it again, if a person is not a swimmer, they're not an athlete. That's trying to say that all athletes are swimmers, and that's not true again. And again, to for the counterexample, you could plug in any other athlete in there. Contrapositive, if a person is not an athlete, then that person is not a swimmer. That would be true. They've flipped it around and they're putting the not in front of both. That's the contrapositive. So if you're not an athlete, you can't be a swimmer, and that is true because swimmers are athletes. So there's quite a few different types of statements that we're going to have to learn and go through next time I see you. We will do several examples together, so don't worry about that. Why are we doing this, you might ask? We're getting ourselves ready to be able to do our proofs. And proofs have a lot to do with if-then type things. So keep this in mind and bring this knowledge with you, and we will use it next time I see you. Have a good night.